Hello, and thank you very much for coming to the celebration for the publication of the Danish translation of my book Rest: Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. Now, Rest has now come out in something like 15 different languages, and it's always really interesting as an author to see a book appear in a language that you yourself don't understand. On the other hand, on a slightly more melancholy note, it's a bit sad that so many countries, so many languages, find a use for a book extolling the value of rest. And it just goes to show how pervasive and global our sense that overwork is inevitable and inescapable has become. I've lived with this in Silicon Valley for the last 2 decades, which is a place that kind of prides itself as the world capital of overwork. But this is unfortunately an attitude that sort of really has taken off everywhere. And it becomes so much a part of daily life or professional identities or assumptions about what you need to do in order to do or great or world changing or important work, that it's really easy to imagine that there is no alternative. But rest makes the case that there is. And it's something that I began to discover a little more than a decade ago when I was on a sabbatical at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, England. And about halfway in, I had an epiphany. I was getting huge amounts of stuff done. I was writing a lot. I was meeting a lot of people. I was reading cool things. But I didn't have the sense of time pressure that is just part of the everyday warp and woof of life here in Silicon Valley. And it made me think, maybe my assumptions about the relationship between work or overwork and achievement were wrong. Maybe, in fact, they were backwards. Maybe I was living the life now in Cambridge that we all need to live in order to do great things, in order to sort of realize, realize our passions. And it started me on a journey that ultimately led to the publication of my book, Rest. Now, an important part of sort of that journey was sort of rethinking my own understanding of what rest is and what role it plays in our lives. And it really comes down to four things. One of them is recognizing that rest is actually a real wellspring in creative processes and lives. It's not something that's kind of optional. It's not something that sort of you do after you've done your creative work. It's actually an important part of it. A corollary of that is that we should see work and rest as partners in sort of a busy and productive life, not as competitors. Two other things. First of all, the best, most restorative kinds of rest are actually active rather than passive. We have a kind of understanding of rest as a sort of entirely, sort of passive thing. It's something that happens sitting on a couch with a bag of salty snacks in one hand and a remote in the other. But in reality, the forms of rest that offer the biggest psychological and physical sort of recharge are ones like, exercise and sports and sort of long walks. And finally, rest is a skill. It's actually, it is something perfectly natural, but it's something that we can get better at. In this respect, it's a little bit like breathing, right? We all know how to breathe, but if you're an athlete or a singer or a Buddhist monk, you learn to use your breath to get a little bit more energy, to project to the back of the auditorium, or sort of to quiet your mind and body. When you look at the lives of really creative people, you look at their daily routines, how many hours they worked, how they spent their time, you discover something of a paradox, which is that even Nobel Prize winners, famous authors, or famous composers, these are people who often were incredibly passionate about their work. And they organized their lives around their work. But they didn't organize their whole days around sort of labor. Indeed, they often worked fewer hours per day, about 4 or 5 hours, than sort of we think are necessary for doing good work. Their lives built in lots of leisure time. They had serious hobbies. They went they took weekends and vacations quite seriously, and yet they achieved great things and had long, prolific careers. So, for example, Charles Darwin, the great naturalist, author of the book, Origin of Species, father of the theory of evolution by natural selection, he was someone who worked really about 5 serious hours a day. By about noon, he was done with sort of the bulk of his labor, and sort of after lunch would spend a couple hours going out on what he called his thinking path, which was a path that he built on the edge of sort of his property in the little village of Down. And that was pretty much his day. There's recent research in neuroscience and the psychology of creativity that suggests that it was not just like Darwin's own sort of native intelligence, but rather the way in which he worked and the schedule and routine that he kept that helps explain why he was able sort of to do the work that he did. Because what scientists have discovered is that, when we relax our minds and think about nothing at all, apparently, it feels like our brains kind of shut down, but they don't. Instead, what happens is that a series of connections in the brain called the default mode network fire up. They activate literally in the time it takes you to blink your eyes. And the default mode network connects together parts of the brain that are involved in sort of visual thinking, that are or think about the past or the future. The default mode is actually something that we exercise all the time, or that really works on our behalf all the time. So, when you're trying to remember the name of the actor who was in that movie and the other thing and the TV show, and you can't remember it, but 3 minutes later you're, doing something else, and all of a sudden the name pops into your head, that's the default mode having worked on a problem even while your conscious attention was directed somewhere else. The more intensively you work on a problem before sort of taking a break, the more likely it seems the default mode will be to take it up, to think about it deeply, to process it, and to generate one of those insights or aha moments that we all consider useful, but which very creative people find so absolutely delightful and essential. And so what highly creative people do when they have the ability, when they have the control over their time, is structure their days to have periods both of deep work, but also periods of what I call deliberate rest. Periods that are breaks that also give their creative subconscious, their default mode network, time to continue working on problems that have eluded their conscious effort. And this is valuable enough so that you really kind of design your day to make sure that you've got enough opportunity, enough time, for the default mode to do its thing, as well as time for you to do the kind of deep work, the kind of super focused, intensive work that's also important for creative achievement. So these daily routines turn out to have a few parts. People who do this optimize their working time of day. What that means is you're not working at all hours, but rather you're very thoughtful and selective about when in the day you try to do your most important, most essential work. Often that means getting up super early in the morning and kind of doing the bulk of your really serious thinking before everybody else is up. You also prioritize intensity of focus rather than length of time. So if you're trying to, if you're working on something really important, you don't try to sort of stretch out the day so that you're working 8 or 10 or 12 hours. Instead, you try and do sort of those same 4 or 5 hours, but sort of push up the sort of intensity level. You layer periods of deep work with periods of deliberate rest in order to both give yourself a break and increase the odds that you'll have a kind of creative boost. And finally, you make it a daily practice. And it seems that the more your mind is exposed to this kind of routine, the more likely it is that it can recognize those breaks as opportunities sort of to take on problems that you haven't solved and sort of to make some progress even while your attention is elsewhere. There's a great line by the behavioral economist Amos Tversky that people waste years because they don't waste hours. You may do interesting work if you sort of attack the obvious problem, but taking the extra time to engage in that apparently unproductive long, hike in the Stanford Hills, as Tversky did with sort of his friends, or sort of to spend time on sort of hobbies that both give you a break in the day, but also allow your creative mind to continue thinking a little more deeply about problems. That if you give yourself the time for these things, you're able to come up with more fundamental ideas than sort of you would otherwise. Now, this is something that doesn't just play out over the course of a day. We see the importance of rest playing out over the course of years and lifetimes. So, for example, vacations turn out to be an important source, not just of or of an opportunity to recharge, but also they can be a source of creative renewal. They are important for sort of our long-term physical and mental health. There are longitudinal studies of, thousands of people over decades that show that people who take regular vacations have better mental health, they have better physical health, they age more gracefully than people who do not. But also, something like 20% of startups are created by people who have ideas for new products or new technologies when they're on vacation. And it's not just tech people for whom this is the case. Lin-Manuel Miranda spent 7 years performing his first musical in the Heights without a break, and was finally convinced by his wife to go on vacation. Right before they left, he threw in a copy of Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, and he said, "As soon as I gave my mind a break from In the Heights, Hamilton jumped into it." And thus began the process that ultimately yielded, one of the great sort of theatrical experiences of the last, 20 or so years. Another important way in which rest plays out over the course of years and helps give shape to and depth to creative lives is in really serious hobbies, or what I call in the book deep play. An amazing number of sort of people who are engaged in, super ambitious projects take time out to go mountain climbing or go sailing. And to me, it seemed weird that, people who really value their time would spend so much time doing things often that were not just time consuming, but sometimes physically challenging, even risky. So why is that? What do you get from deep play? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand, first of all, what deep play is. Deep play has several features. First of all, it's appealing because it offers some of the same challenges and rewards as work, but without any of the frustrations. It delivers those rewards in different contexts and timescales. It's often physically challenging as well as being sort of mentally challenging. And there's often something about it that harkens back to one's childhood or sort of some other sort of pleasant sort of earlier experience. So when you talk to scientists, for example, about who are serious mountain climbers, about what they like about it, people like Rosalind Franklin, the X-ray crystallographer who helped figure out the structure of DNA, shown on the left, or Henry Kendall on the right, they will tell you that they like climbing because climbing is like science, right? It's a way of engaging in a really profound way with nature. It's like science in that you take a big task, you break it down into a bunch of small goals, which you then have to execute one after another. But it's different from science in that it has incredibly clear goals and outcomes, and they happen very quickly. In contrast to an experiment that might take months or years, at the end of the day, either you've made it to sort of the peak or you haven't. Winston Churchill was a serious amateur painter, and he actually wrote a book called Painting as a Pastime, in which he explained why painting was great for sort of busy people and what he got out of it. And he began by saying that the tired parts of the mind can be rested and strengthened not merely by rest, but by using other parts. It is not enough merely to switch off the lights which play upon the main and ordinary field of interest. A new field of interest must be illuminated. Just to paint is great fun, he said. The colors are lovely to look at and delicious to squeeze out, In other words, it is physical and visual in a way that writing or political argument and crafting legislation was not. But it was also similar in the way that painting a picture is like fighting a battle. It is the same kind of problem as unfolding a long, sustained, interlocked argument. It is a proposition which, whether of few or numberless parts, is commanded by a single unity of conception. So it was all the stuff he liked about politics without the frustrations, and played out in a very different kind of time scale, in hours rather than months or years. So deep play turns out to be important in the lives of creative people for a few reasons. First of all, at a practical level, it enforces boundaries and forces better time management. Deep play is also important because it reminds us of what we love best about work when it succeeds. For people who work in fields that encourage perfectionism, in which imposter syndrome is a challenge, having something with really clear standards and outcomes can be very reassuring. It also builds resilience. It puts failures in perspective. It provides long-term physical and mental health benefits. It helps make careers and lives more balanced and more sustainable. And the similarity of attractions and personal connections make it competitive with work in a way that just doing nothing, quote unquote, does not. Now, lots of the people in Rest lived rather privileged lives, but I was curious after I finished the book whether it was possible to kind of democratize the experience of rest and to make it something that is available to more of us. What, for example, if you're working a 9-to-5 job, is it possible to take some of the lessons of rest and put them into practice in your own lives? And it turns out that there actually are hundreds of companies that have done exactly this. As I detail in my new book about the 4-day work week, companies that have shortened their working hours without cutting salaries, without cutting expectations around output or productivity, have shown that it's possible to apply the lessons of rest at scale for everybody in a way that actually makes companies more resilient, better, and happier places to work. One essential insight in the 4-day week movement is that the 4-day week, in a sense, is already here because, as studies show, something like 2 to 3 hours a day are lost to meetings, distractions, and poor technology use. So if you can just clear those out of the way, out of people's schedules, you can go a long way to doing 5 days worth of work in 4. It's also notable because everybody collaborates to share the same reward, right? Nobody loses out on my working a 4-day week if everybody else is also working a 4-day week. And we all have to cooperate in order to make that possible. It turns what previously sometimes has been a zero-sum game into a win-win. It also recognizes that attention and focus have an important social dimension. My ability to focus at work depends in part on my colleagues' abilities to respect my need to concentrate and to get work done. And there's also a kind of psychological dimension to the collective nature of focus and attention. Anybody who's studied in a library during finals, being among other people who are concentrating hard, knows that that kind of company can help you concentrate better, even if all of you are studying separate things. And finally, these companies show us that structural collective solutions to problems of burnout and work-life balance are more sustainable and and longer lasting than individual solutions. We all share these problems, even though they look maybe a little bit different in all of our lives, but binding together, joining together in order to solve them by doing things like redesigning the workday, turns out to offer solutions that benefit us all. So, to wrap up, looking across both individuals who discover the value of rest and companies that discover how to put rest into practice at scale, we see a few things. First of all, rest is important as a creative wellspring. that it provides space for insights and aha moments. It gives us an opportunity to sort of think through ideas more deeply and potentially to come up with solutions to problems or angles that that our conscious minds have not. It also teaches us that we should see work and rest as partners in creative and productive lives, not as competitors. And that we can do this by layering periods of deep work with deliberate rest in our daily lives. Taking weekends and vacations seriously, exercising deep play, and shortening our work weeks. We also learn that rest is active, that sort of breaks, exercise, vacations, 4-day weeks, these are all opportunities for sort of taking active rest rather than just doing nothing. That indeed this is more restorative. It's often for busy people, people who have trouble slowing down, is sort of more appealing. And finally, that rest is a skill. It's something that we can learn to get better at, whether this is through hobbies, whether it's through design of sort of the way entire companies work. So, I hope you enjoy the book in whatever language you read it, and I hope you're able to take its lessons and to put them into practice so that you can find sort of more rest and do better work in your own life. Thanks very much.